Somewhere in the ancient world, long before anyone had ever heard the word cholesterol, healers were already paying close attention to a food so ordinary, so quietly available, that people gathered it fresh each morning without a second thought. Greek physicians wrote about its nourishing power. Roman soldiers carried it on long campaigns. Traditional Chinese medicine regarded it as a tonic for vitality and recovery. Ayurvedic healers in India prescribed it for weakness and rebuilding the body after illness. For thousands of years and across dozens of civilizations that never spoke the same language or shared the same continent, human beings arrived at the same instinctive conclusion: this food was something special. And then, in the latter half of the 20th century, modern medicine did something extraordinary. It looked at that ancient food and told people to be afraid of it, to limit it, to eat as little as possible. The food, of course, is the egg. And the question being asked today, backed by some of the most sophisticated nutritional research of the last 2 decades, is whether we were wrong. What actually happens, deep inside your body, when you eat 4 eggs every single day? Not occasionally, not once in a while, every day. The answer is far more layered, far more fascinating, and frankly far more reassuring than most people expect. And it starts in a place most of us have never thought to look. Before we get into the science, I want to ask you something. If someone told you right now that one of the most feared foods of the last 50 years might actually be one of the most nourishing things you could put on your plate, would you believe them? Let that question sit with you. Because by the end of this video, you are going to have a genuinely different relationship with what is sitting in your refrigerator right now. We are going to go layer by layer through what the science actually shows, from the moment you swallow that first bite all the way through to what is happening hours later in your brain, your blood vessels, your muscles, and your liver. 3 distinct and deeply connected stories, each one more surprising than the last. We will begin where the egg begins, inside the yolk, with one of the most controversial molecules in modern medicine. Then we will travel to your cardiovascular system, where the cholesterol conversation gets far more complicated and interesting than you have ever been told. And finally, we will arrive somewhere most nutrition videos never bother to go, your brain and your nervous system, where the egg may be doing something quietly remarkable. Stay with me, because the third part is the one that genuinely surprised me when I first read the research. So let us begin at the very beginning, which is to say, at the yolk. Pick up an egg and crack it open, and what you see is that deep golden center, almost orange if the hen has been eating well, sitting in a translucent white cushion. Most people look at that yolk with a mixture of desire and mild guilt. For decades, the public health message was clear. The yolk is where the cholesterol lives, and cholesterol is dangerous, so limit the yolks, eat the whites, or better yet, buy the little carton of egg substitute. But here is where the story starts to unravel in a genuinely interesting way. A single large egg yolk contains somewhere around 185 milligrams of dietary cholesterol. That is not a small number. For years, official guidelines in many countries said adults should consume no more than 300 milligrams of cholesterol per day, which effectively meant 1 egg was already getting you most of the way there, and 2 eggs took you over the edge. The problem, which nutritional scientists began noticing in earnest in the 1990s and could no longer ignore by the 2010s, is that the assumption underlying that guideline turned out to be far less solid than it appeared. The assumption was this: eat cholesterol, and the cholesterol in your blood goes up. Simple, logical, clean, and largely wrong. Here is what is actually happening inside your body when you eat dietary cholesterol. Your liver, that tireless biochemical factory sitting just under your right rib cage, is producing cholesterol continuously on its own, every single day. It has to. Cholesterol is not a poison. It is a fundamental building block. Your body uses it to make every single one of your sex hormones, including estrogen and testosterone. It uses it to produce vitamin D when sunlight hits your skin. It uses it to coat and protect every nerve in your body. It is a structural component of every cell membrane you have. Without cholesterol, you could not survive. Your liver knows this, and so it calibrates. When you eat more dietary cholesterol, your liver makes less of its own. When you eat less, the liver compensates by producing more. This feedback loop is called cholesterol homeostasis, and you can think of it like a thermostat in a well-regulated house. The system adjusts to keep the temperature roughly stable, regardless of what the weather is doing outside. Now, this thermostat is not equally sensitive in every person. Researchers have identified something called hyperresponders, people whose blood cholesterol does rise more meaningfully when they eat dietary cholesterol. But even in those individuals, the picture is nuanced, because the type of cholesterol that rises tends to be large, buoyant LDL particles, which current evidence suggests are far less associated with cardiovascular risk than the small, dense LDL particles that are raised primarily by refined carbohydrates and industrial trans fat. For the majority of people, roughly 2/3 of the population, eating eggs has very little effect on total blood cholesterol levels, and what effect it does have tends to shift the ratio in a favorable direction by raising HDL, the so-called good cholesterol, alongside it. A landmark study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition followed participants who consumed 3 eggs per day for 12 weeks and found that while LDL did increase slightly in some participants, HDL increased proportionally as well, keeping the LDL to HDL ratio essentially stable, which is the measurement most cardiologists consider the most meaningful indicator of cardiovascular risk. Another study, this one, a large prospective analysis published in the British Medical Journal in 2020, looked at data from nearly 500,000 people across multiple countries and found no significant association between moderate to high egg consumption and cardiovascular disease or mortality. 500,000 people, that is not a small sample, that is a signal worth taking seriously. And yet the egg's relationship with your cardiovascular system does not stop at cholesterol, because the yolk contains something else that the scientific community spent decades almost entirely ignoring, and it turns out to be one of the most functionally important nutrients in the entire egg. It is called choline. You may not have heard of it. Most people have not, despite the fact that your body cannot function without it. Choline is the raw material your body uses to build acetylcholine, which is one of the most important chemical messengers in your nervous system, responsible for everything from muscle contraction to memory consolidation to the regulation of your heart rate. Your body can synthesize a small amount of choline on its own, but nowhere near enough to cover its needs. You have to get most of it from food. And 2 of the richest dietary sources on the planet are egg yolks and liver. A single large egg contains roughly 147 milligrams of choline. 4 eggs a day would give you somewhere around 590 milligrams, which is above the adequate intake level set by most national nutrition bodies, which sits at 425 milligrams for women and 550 milligrams for men. In other words, 4 eggs a day essentially covers your entire daily choline requirement from a single food. That matters enormously, and we will come back to why it matters for your brain in just a moment. But first, I want to stay with the cardiovascular picture a little longer, because there is a compound in eggs that most people have genuinely never heard of, and it has a fascinating relationship with your blood vessel walls. Eggs are one of the only foods that contain meaningful amounts of lutein and zeaxanthin, 2 carotenoid pigments that most people associate with eye health but which also appear to play a protective role in the cardiovascular system. These pigments accumulate in the walls of blood vessels and in the tissues of the eye, and research has linked higher blood levels of lutein with lower rates of arterial stiffness and reduced thickness of the carotid artery wall, which is one of the most reliable early warning signs of atherosclerosis, the process by which arteries gradually narrow and harden. Think of lutein and zeaxanthin as the maintenance crew that keeps the lining of your pipes smooth and flexible. They are doing quiet, continuous work that you will only notice if it stops. A clinical study published in the journal Atherosclerosis followed 1,094 adults and found that those with the highest blood levels of lutein had significantly thinner carotid artery walls compared to those with the lowest levels, independent of other cardiovascular risk factors. The researchers noted that egg consumption was among the key dietary predictors of higher lutein levels, precisely because the fat in the yolk dramatically improves lutein absorption compared to plant sources like spinach or kale, where the lutein is present but the fat content is low, making absorption far less efficient. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You have probably heard about TMAO, trimethylamine N-oxide. It became a headline a few years ago when a study suggested that choline from eggs could be converted by gut bacteria into a compound associated with cardiovascular disease. It is a legitimate concern and it deserves an honest answer. The research on TMAO is real, but it is also far more complicated than the headlines suggested. More recent and larger studies have found that the relationship between dietary choline, TMAO, and actual cardiovascular events in humans is not nearly as strong or as linear as early cell and animal studies implied. People who eat fish, for example, have very high TMAO levels and consistently show better cardiovascular outcomes than people who do not. The gut microbiome plays an enormous mediating role, meaning the bacteria you carry in your digestive system largely determine how much TMAO you produce from a given food. A healthy, diverse gut microbiome appears to handle choline far more cleanly. This is an area where the science is still evolving, and intellectual honesty requires saying so. But the current weight of evidence, across large human cohort studies, does not support avoiding eggs on the basis of TMAO alone. Before we move into the next part of this story, which is where it gets genuinely remarkable, I want to mention something for those of you who want to go significantly deeper into the nutritional science behind foods like this one. We have put together something called the Health Decoded Complete Pack, and in it we go into much greater detail on the mechanisms behind whole foods, what the most current research actually shows about cholesterol, inflammation, gut health, and dozens of other topics that come up repeatedly in these videos. You can find the link in the description below, or you can scan the QR code that is on screen right now. It is designed for exactly the kind of curious, thoughtful viewer who made it this far into this video, and I promise you, what we are about to discuss next, about what 4 eggs a day does to your brain and your muscle tissue over weeks and months, is the part that makes the bigger picture of why that resource exists feel genuinely necessary. So let us go there. Let us talk about the brain, because this is the part of the egg story that I believe most people, even those who have been paying close attention to nutrition for years, do not fully appreciate. Your brain is roughly 60% fat. That is not a metaphor, it is a literal structural fact. The brain is the fattiest organ in your body, and one of the fats it depends on most heavily is a long-chain omega-3 fatty acid called DHA. You may know that name from fish oil supplements. What fewer people realize is that eggs, particularly eggs from hens raised on pasture or fed omega-3 enriched feed, contain meaningful amounts of DHA directly in the yolk. Standard commercial eggs contain less than pastured or omega-3 eggs, but they still contain some, and that DHA is doing something in your brain that takes years to understand the full significance of. DHA is incorporated directly into the membranes of your brain cells. It makes those membranes more fluid, more flexible, better at sending and receiving signals. The best analogy I have found is to think of your brain cell membranes as doors. A door made of stiff, dry wood can technically open and close, but it sticks, it creaks, it does not move smoothly. A door that has been properly maintained, oiled, flexible, swings open effortlessly. That is what adequate DHA does for brain cell communication. Signals travel faster, more cleanly, more efficiently. Over time, this matters for memory, for processing speed, for the ability to concentrate, and emerging research suggests it may matter for the prevention of cognitive decline. But DHA alone is not the most surprising part of the egg-brain connection. That distinction belongs to choline. Remember we mentioned it earlier in the context of the cardiovascular system. Now we arrive at why it truly earns its place in this story. Your brain converts choline into acetylcholine, and acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter most directly associated with memory and learning. It is the chemical signal your hippocampus, the brain's memory center, relies on most heavily when it is forming new memories or retrieving old ones. As we age, acetylcholine production declines, and this decline has been directly linked to the cognitive changes that many people over 50 begin to notice. The word that is just out of reach, the name that takes a moment longer to retrieve, the mental fogginess that was not there at 40. Alzheimer's disease, the most common form of dementia, is characterized partly by a dramatic loss of acetylcholine-producing neurons, which is why several of the drugs developed to treat it work by trying to prevent acetylcholine from being broken down too quickly. What the research suggests is that maintaining adequate choline intake throughout your life may help preserve the raw material your brain needs to keep those neurons working as long as possible. A remarkable study from the University of Eastern Finland followed 2,497 middle-aged men over a period of 22 years. The men with the highest dietary choline intake performed significantly better on tests of cognitive function, particularly tests involving memory and verbal fluency, compared to those with the lowest intake. When the researchers looked at brain imaging, men with higher choline intake also showed fewer signs of white matter lesions, the small areas of damage in the brain's connective tissue that are associated with cognitive decline and increased stroke risk. 22 years. That is not a short-term metabolic study, that is a long view of what a nutrient does to a human brain over decades of daily life. And here is the thing that makes eggs uniquely valuable in this context, as opposed to simply taking a choline supplement. The egg delivers choline alongside fat, specifically alongside the phospholipid structures that make choline most bioavailable to brain tissue. Phosphatidylcholine, the form in which choline exists in the egg yolk, is absorbed and utilized by the brain more efficiently than supplemental choline in other forms. The egg is, in a sense, the perfect delivery vehicle for its own most important nutrient. Nature packaged them together for a reason. Now let us talk about the protein story, because it would be a significant omission to discuss 4 eggs a day without addressing what they do to your muscles and your overall body composition. And this is particularly relevant for anyone watching who is over 50, because the stakes here are higher than most people realize. Muscle mass is not just an aesthetic concern, it is a metabolic organ. The more muscle tissue you have, the more efficiently your body handles blood sugar, the more insulin-sensitive your cells remain, the higher your resting metabolism, and crucially for longer-term health outcomes, the more robust your physical capacity as you age. The medical term for the age-related loss of muscle mass and strength is sarcopenia, and it begins earlier than people think, typically in the mid-30s, and accelerates meaningfully after 60. Dietary protein is the primary nutritional driver of muscle protein synthesis, which is the technical phrase for the process by which your body builds and repairs muscle tissue, and not all protein is created equal. Protein quality is determined partly by something called the digestible indispensable amino acid score, which is essentially a measure of how completely and efficiently a given food's protein can be used by your body. Egg protein scores higher on this scale than almost any other food, including beef, dairy, and soy. In practical terms, this means that the protein in an egg is almost entirely available to your muscles and tissues in a way that plant proteins, which are often bound up in fiber structures and antinutrients, frequently are not. 4 eggs provide approximately 24 to 28 grams of complete protein, with every essential amino acid your body cannot manufacture on its own present in excellent ratios. Among these, leucine is perhaps the most critical. Leucine acts like a key that unlocks the muscle-building process. It is the amino acid that most directly triggers the pathway your cells use to begin synthesizing new muscle protein. Without adequate leucine, even if you eat enough total protein, the muscle-building signal is muted. Eggs are an excellent source of leucine, delivering around 2.5 grams across 4 eggs, which is right at the threshold many researchers consider optimal for triggering robust muscle protein synthesis. A study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition compared the muscle protein synthesis response in older adults after consuming either whole eggs or an equivalent amount of egg whites with the same total protein content. What they found was striking. The whole eggs produced a significantly greater muscle protein synthesis response than the egg whites, even though the protein content was identical. The researchers attributed this to the additional nutrients in the yolk, particularly the fat-soluble vitamins and the hormonal precursors, which appear to amplify the muscle-building signal beyond what protein alone can achieve. This is a finding that cuts directly against decades of advice telling people to throw away the yolk. The implications for someone over 60 are profound. Sarcopenia is not inevitable, but fighting it requires adequate protein, specifically high-quality protein with sufficient leucine, consistently throughout the day. 4 eggs, spread across meals or consumed at breakfast, represent one of the most affordable and complete protein sources available. And because eggs are soft, easy to prepare, easy to digest, and require almost no culinary skill to make palatable in 100 different ways, they have a practical accessibility that expensive protein supplements and elaborate meal plans simply do not. Speaking of practical, let us talk about what 4 eggs a day means in terms of vitamins and minerals, because the list is long and genuinely impressive, and it touches on deficiencies that are extraordinarily common in older adults. Eggs are one of the few dietary sources of vitamin D outside of sun exposure and fatty fish. A large egg contains roughly 44 international units of vitamin D, which is not enormous, but 4 eggs contributes meaningfully to an intake that surveys consistently show most adults in temperate climates fall short of. Vitamin D is not just a bone nutrient. It regulates immune function, modulates inflammatory responses, influences mood, and plays a role in muscle function. Low vitamin D is associated with increased fracture risk, higher rates of depression, impaired immune defense, and in recent years has been linked in large observational studies with greater susceptibility to a range of chronic diseases. Eggs are also rich in vitamin B12, a nutrient that becomes harder to absorb as we age because the stomach produces less of the compound, called intrinsic factor, that is necessary to extract B12 from food. 2 eggs provide roughly 46% of the daily recommended intake of B12. 4 eggs gets you close to the full daily requirement from this single source. B12 deficiency is profoundly underdiagnosed in older adults and can cause everything from persistent fatigue and weakness to numbness in the extremities to genuine cognitive impairment that is sometimes mistaken for dementia. Eggs, as a soft, accessible, highly bioavailable source of B12, deserve more credit in this conversation than they typically receive. Then there is selenium, a mineral that acts as a cofactor for several of the body's most powerful antioxidant enzymes. These enzymes, particularly the glutathione peroxidase family, are among the body's primary internal defense systems against oxidative damage, the kind of cellular wear and tear that accumulates with age and is thought to underlie much of the tissue damage associated with chronic disease and aging. 2 eggs provide roughly 56% of the recommended daily selenium intake. 4 eggs essentially covers the full daily requirement. And vitamin A, which is present in the yolk as retinol, the direct, immediately usable form rather than the beta-carotene precursor that your body must first convert and frequently does not do efficiently, supports skin integrity, mucous membrane health, immune surveillance and vision, particularly night vision, which declines with age partly due to retinol insufficiency. The egg is, in a real sense, one of the most nutrient-dense foods per calorie available on the planet. A large egg contains roughly 70 to 80 calories. 4 eggs is somewhere around 300 calories. For that caloric investment, you are receiving a package of complete protein, fat-soluble vitamins, water-soluble B vitamins, minerals, carotenoids, choline and omega-3 fatty acids that would cost you many times more calories to replicate from other sources, if you could replicate it at all. Now, what about the practical question of how to actually eat 4 eggs a day without it becoming monotonous or feeling like a chore? This is where the ancient culinary tradition becomes relevant in a different way. Eggs have been at the center of human cooking for so long that virtually every cuisine on Earth has developed dozens of ways to prepare them, and the nutritional content, while it does vary slightly with cooking method, remains substantial regardless of how you cook them. Boiling preserves the most nutrients overall. Poaching is similarly gentle. Scrambling with a low to moderate heat preserves most of the protein and fat content, though some B vitamins are modestly reduced. Frying in healthy fat, meaning butter, olive oil, or coconut oil, adds calories but does not meaningfully destroy the egg's nutritional profile. Cooking the egg does reduce biotin absorption from the raw white, because raw egg white contains a protein called avidin that binds biotin and prevents its absorption, so cooked eggs actually deliver more biotin than raw eggs, which is a counterintuitive fact worth remembering. Hard-boiled eggs, prepared in batches, are one of the most practical things a person can keep in the refrigerator. They stay fresh for up to a week. They require no cooking equipment at the moment of eating, they are portable, and they pair with virtually anything. 2 eggs at breakfast and 2 at another meal is a completely natural rhythm that most people adapt to without much conscious effort. And now the honest, responsible part of this conversation, because no science video for a health audience is complete without it. For most healthy adults, the evidence suggests that consuming 4 eggs per day is unlikely to cause harm and may confer meaningful health benefits, particularly for those over 50. However, context matters. If you have type 2 diabetes, the research on egg consumption and cardiovascular risk is somewhat less uniformly reassuring, with some studies showing a stronger association between high egg intake and cardiovascular events in diabetic populations than in non-diabetic ones. This does not mean eggs are forbidden, but it does mean that people managing diabetes should have this specific conversation with their doctor or dietitian rather than making the decision in isolation. If you have familial hypercholesterolemia, a genetic condition that causes very high blood cholesterol levels independently of diet, you may be among the hyper-responders for whom dietary cholesterol has a more pronounced effect and medical supervision is appropriate. If you have existing kidney disease, the higher protein intake from 4 daily eggs may require monitoring. And if you are pregnant, eggs are genuinely beneficial, rich in choline, which is critical for fetal brain development, and the protein is excellent, but they must be fully cooked to avoid the risk of salmonella. These are not reasons to fear eggs. They are reasons to bring them into a thoughtful, individualized conversation with your healthcare provider if any of these conditions apply to you. What is clear from the totality of the research, the large prospective cohort studies, the clinical trials, the mechanistic research, the dietary surveys of populations that eat eggs regularly and live long, healthy lives, is that the blanket fear of eggs that dominated public health messaging for much of the second half of the 20th century was not supported by the evidence available even then, and is emphatically not supported by what we know now. The 2015 revision of the United States Dietary Guidelines removed the specific numerical limit on dietary cholesterol for the first time in decades, acknowledging that the evidence linking dietary cholesterol to cardiovascular disease in the general population was not strong enough to justify a numerical cap. Similar revisions have occurred in guidelines across Europe and Australia. We spent 50 years telling people to be cautious of one of the most nutritious, affordable, accessible, and ancient foods in human history. The healers who prescribed eggs for recovery and vitality were not working on superstition. They were working on observation, on the accumulated clinical experience of watching their patients get better when they ate them. And now, with randomized controlled trials and genome-wide association studies and 22-year longitudinal cohorts, we are arriving at roughly the same place they arrived at through centuries of careful watching. Hippocrates, to whom the famous phrase is attributed, said, "Let food be thy medicine, and medicine be thy food." He lived in a world where he could not possibly have known what acetylcholine was, or measured a carotid intima media thickness, or understood the molecular structure of phosphatidylcholine. But he watched what happened when people ate certain foods consistently over time, and he drew conclusions. Modern science, with all its extraordinary tools, is sitting down beside him and saying, "Yes, you were largely right, not about everything, not in every detail." but about the fundamental principle that what we eat is medicine, that the simplest, most ancient foods often carry the most profound biology, and that the body, when given what it has evolved over millions of years to use, will do remarkable things with it. So the next time you open your refrigerator and see those eggs sitting quietly on the shelf, perhaps you will see them differently. Not as a guilty pleasure, not as a question mark hanging over your cholesterol levels, but as something your great-grandmother knew instinctively, something that ancient physicians prescribed confidently, something that your brain, your blood vessels, your muscles, and your eyes are genuinely waiting for. 4 eggs is not excess. According to the science, it might be closer to exactly right, and I would love to know what you think. Have you always eaten eggs freely? Or were you among the millions who reduced them or avoided them after hearing the old warnings? Leave a comment below. I read them, and these conversations always go somewhere interesting. If this video gave you something new to think about, share it with someone who might need it. And if you have not yet, hit that like button, because it genuinely helps more people find this kind of content. We will see you in the next one.